London, April 15th, 1817. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Lady Harrington's ballroom, casting golden light across the polished floor where couples turned in elegant patterns, while Clara Thornhill stood in the shadowed alcove near the musicians' gallery, her dove-grey dress rendering her nearly invisible among the potted ferns and marble columns. She had perfected this art over 3 years as companion to Isabella Fairfax, the science of disappearing in plain sight, of existing without disturbing the social landscape that had no place for a woman of 27 with neither fortune nor beauty to recommend her. The whispers reached her anyway, they always did, the casual cruelties delivered in cultured voices. Poor creature, what a shame. Plain as a wren, passed over entirely. Destined for obscurity Clara's fingers tightened on the small volume of poetry she had secreted in her reticule, the words inside more real to her than the glittering assembly before her. That morning, an extraordinary thing had occurred. A letter had arrived, slipped beneath her door with no signature, containing only a few lines about the quality of spring light and how it illuminated truth that winter had concealed. She had dismissed it as misdirection, some missive gone astray, though the words had kindled something dangerous in her chest, something like hope, which she had learned to extinguish quickly. Now Isabella swept past in pink silk that caught every eye, her golden curls arranged to perfection, her laugh musical and bright as she danced with Lord Redmond, then Mr. Sinclair, collecting admirers like flowers. A stir rippled through the ballroom, conversations faltering and resuming with greater animation. He had arrived. Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Westmont, recently returned from the continent, subject of intense speculation among the marriage-minded mothers who calculated his age at 32, his fortune considerable, his need for an heir urgent. Clara watched from her shadows as he entered, tall and commanding in black evening clothes, his dark hair swept back from a face too stern for conventional handsomeness, but arresting nonetheless, and his eyes, piercing blue even at this distance, surveyed the room with what seemed like weary resignation. Lady Harrington descended upon him immediately, effecting introductions with strategic precision, and within moments he stood before Isabella, who deployed her most dazzling smile. Clara observed the practiced choreography, the way Isabella's hand rested briefly on his arm, the graceful inclination of her head, the performance she had witnessed 100 times. The Duke bowed correctly, said something Clara could not hear, and Isabella laughed, that carefully calibrated sound of delight. Yet as he straightened, his gaze moved past Isabella's shoulder and found Clara in her alcove, the small book now open in her hands, and for one breathless moment their eyes met. Something flickered in his expression, a sharpening of attention, a question forming. Then Lady Harrington spoke again, and the moment shattered. He turned back to Isabella, offering his arm for the next dance. Clara released a breath she had not known she held, and looked down at the page before her, the words swimming. Hours later, retrieving her reticule to depart, she found a second letter tucked inside, the paper still warm as though recently placed. The hand was the same. This time the words spoke of a woman half hidden who contained more truth than all the glittering assembly combined, and Clara's hands trembled as she read it twice, 3 times, her heart beating a wild rhythm against her ribs, while confusion and something dangerously like joy warred within her, and she wondered with sudden sharp fear whether this was kindness or the cruelest joke of all. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. April 22nd, 1817. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Isabella's drawing room. illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars, while Clara arranged the tea service with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the turmoil that had taken residence in her chest since the letters had begun arriving, 8 now in total. Each one slipped beneath her door at dawn like a secret too precious for daylight. She had confided in Martha Langley 2 days prior, spreading the correspondence across the widow's modest sitting-room table with trembling fingers, watching as Martha read each one with increasing attention before pronouncing what Clara had hardly dared to think, that these were the words of a man truly smitten, deeply observant, someone who saw her. Yet Clara could not reconcile this mysterious correspondent with any gentleman of her acquaintance, for who among them had ever noticed her at all? And the possibility that it was some cruel entertainment, a wager perhaps, haunted her even as she treasured each line. The sound of carriage wheels on the street below drew Isabella to the window where she preened, adjusting her pale blue muslin and touching her arranged curls. For the Duke of Westmont had called 4 times in the past week, and Isabella's confidence grew with each visit, her conviction that she would be a duchess by season's end, lending her movements an almost regal quality. When Alexander was announced, he entered bearing white roses, their delicate scent filling the room as he presented them to Isabella, with a bow that satisfied propriety, if not warmth. And Clara noted, as she always did now, how his eyes moved past her hostess, searching briefly before he seemed to recall himself to the present moment. Isabella accepted the flowers with studied delight, gesturing for Clara to find a vase while she engaged the Duke in conversation about the weather, the latest exhibition at Somerset House, Lady Harrington's upcoming musicale, topics that required nothing of substance and received even less. Clara moved about her tasks invisibly, pouring tea with hands that had performed this service 1,000 times, offering biscuits that were declined, existing in that peculiar state of being present yet utterly unseen that she had perfected through necessity. Yet today she felt the weight of observation, a prickling awareness that raised the fine hairs at the nape of her neck, and twice when she glanced up she found Alexander's gaze resting on her before he redirected his attention to Isabella with what seemed almost like effort. The conversation continued its predictable course until Isabella suggested she might play, moving to the pianoforte with the certainty of one accustomed to admiration, and as she began a complicated piece that showcased technical skill over feeling, Alexander rose and moved about the room with the restlessness of a man confined. He paused beside the side table where a book lay open, a volume of essays Clara had been reading that morning before Isabella had called her to prepare for visitors. His hand touched the leather binding. Then he turned. "Miss Thornhill," he said quietly, and Clara started at being addressed directly. "You are reading Montaigne." It was not a question, but she answered anyway, her voice steady despite her surprise. "Yes, Your Grace, I find his thoughts on friendship particularly compelling." Alexander's expression shifted, interest sharpening his features. "Which essay?" "The one on presumption," Clara replied, "where he discusses how we often fail to see what is before us because we are looking for what we expect to see rather than what truly is." Something flickered across his face then, recognition perhaps, or assessment, and he opened his mouth to respond when Isabella's playing concluded with a flourish, and she called for his opinion, her voice carrying a note of demand wrapped in sweetness. He returned to his duties, praising her performance with words that rang hollow to Clara's ear, though Isabella accepted them as her due, and soon after he took his leave, bowing over Isabella's hand while Clara stood in her shadow. That evening the letter that arrived spoke of a conversation overheard about Montaigne, about a woman whose insight cut through pretense to truth, about how rare it was to find a mind that questioned rather than accepted, and Clara's hands shook as she read because only 3 people had been present for that exchange, and the impossible began to seem merely improbable, though she could not yet let herself believe what her heart whispered in the darkness. May 3rd, 1817. The Theatre Royal stood ablaze with lamplight against the gathering dusk. Its interior a cathedral of gilt and crimson velvet, where the cream of London society assembled in their boxes like jewels in settings, each display carefully arranged for maximum effect, while Clara Thornhill followed Isabella and Martha up the carpeted stairs to the Fairfax box, her dress of deeper grey than usual with a touch of silver trim at the cuffs. A concession Martha had insisted upon when the invitation had arrived 3 days prior. The letters now numbered 20, each one more passionate than the last, speaking of thoughts that occupied the writer's waking hours and invaded his dreams, describing details of Clara's person she had never considered worthy of notice, the way she tilted her head when considering a question, the unconscious grace of her hands when she moved them in conversation, the intelligence that illuminated her features from within like candlelight through alabaster, and she kept them in the locked rosewood box that had been her mother's, reading them each night until the words were imprinted on her heart, even as her mind insisted this could not be real, could not last, must inevitably reveal itself as either mistake or cruelty. Martha had taken her hands 2 evenings past and spoken with unusual intensity, her weathered face serious in the firelight. "Child," she had said, "I have lived 50 years and buried a husband I loved dearly, and I tell you these letters are written by a man deeply in love, a man who sees you truly, and I believe I know who that man is, though you are not yet ready to accept it." Clara had protested, but Martha had continued. "The Duke looks at you when he thinks himself unobserved. He creates opportunities for conversation. He listens when you speak as though memorizing every word, and these letters contain details only someone present during his visits could know." Clara's heart had hammered against her ribs because she had begun to suspect the same impossible thing, but how could she reconcile Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Westmont, who arrived faithfully to court Isabella with flowers and compliments and every appearance of serious intention, with the anonymous correspondent who wrote of longing and recognition and a connection that transcended the superficial measures by which society judged worth. Now she settled into her seat at the back of the box, Martha beside her, while Isabella arranged herself in the front row with calculated perfection, her rose silk gown cut to display her figure to advantage, her golden curls dressed high, her fan deployed with practiced grace, for Alexander had formally requested permission to court her with serious intent 4 days ago, and Isabella glowed with the certainty of imminent triumph. When he entered their box, bowing over Isabella's hand with correct formality, Clara felt the now familiar tightening in her chest. The painful awareness that had grown with each letter, each secret word of devotion, and she forced herself to look away, to study the stage below, where actors prepared for the evening's performance of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, a comedy of misunderstanding and concealed affection that seemed to mock her current situation. Alexander took his seat beside Isabella, who immediately engaged him in animated conversation about acquaintances visible in other boxes, and Clara tried to focus on the stage, on the musicians tuning their instruments, on anything except the broad shoulders in dark evening clothes just 3 feet before her. But she felt hyper-aware of every movement, every shift of his position, the timbre of his voice when he responded to Isabella's remarks. From the box to their left, she caught the glitter of focused attention and turned to find Lydia Ashford watching their party with avid interest, her sharp features arranged in an expression of calculation, and Clara's stomach tightened with instinctive wariness, for Lydia collected gossip the way others collected china, displaying each piece of scandal with equal pride. The play began, and Clara tried to lose herself in the familiar story, but during the interval when Isabella excused herself to visit acquaintances in another box, Dragging Martha as chaperone with obvious reluctance, Alexander turned in his seat and fixed Clara with those piercing blue eyes. "Miss Thornhill," he said quietly, "what is your opinion of Beatrice's resistance to love? Do you find it admirable or merely stubborn?" The question caught her off guard, too direct, too personal. And she found herself responding honestly. "I think she is afraid, Your Grace. She has been hurt or has observed hurt in others, and she protects herself with wit and denial, but protection becomes a prison if maintained too long." His gaze intensified, and he leaned slightly closer. And if someone were to breach those defenses, what then? Clara's breath caught because this was no longer discussion of a play, but something else entirely, something dangerous and intoxicating. Then she would have to decide whether safety or truth matters more, whether the risk of pain is worth the possibility of genuine connection. The silence between them stretched, charged with unspoken recognition, and Clara saw frustration flicker across his features when Isabella's laugh echoed from across the theatre, signaling her imminent return. That night the letter waiting beneath her door was passionate, nearly desperate, describing how Clara's face in the theatre's dim light had seemed luminous, how her words about truth and connection had pierced him to the core, how watching her from 3 feet away while maintaining pretense of attention elsewhere had become an exquisite torture. And Clara pressed the paper to her chest in the darkness of her small room and allowed herself finally to believe what her heart had been whispering, that Alexander Pembroke loved her, impossibly and completely, and she loved him in return, though she could not fathom how this story could end as anything but heartbreak. May 10th, 1817. Lady Chamberlain's gardens lay resplendent under the mild afternoon sun. Roses blooming in profusion along manicured paths where the elite of London society strolled in calculated patterns of social display, and Clara Thornhill moved among them like a shadow, her grey dress seeming to absorb rather than reflect the light, while Isabella glided ahead on pathways lined with pink and white blossoms, her pale yellow silk gown and confident bearing announcing her expectation that today would bring the culmination of weeks of courtship, for all society whispered that the Duke of Westmont would surely propose before the week's end, and Isabella's triumph would be complete. The letters now numbered 27, each one more precious than the last, and Clara kept them in the rosewood box that travelled with her everywhere, their words imprinted on her heart like sacred text, and the most recent had arrived just yesterday with instructions that had made her hands tremble, asking her to leave a reply if she so wished beneath the sundial in Lady Chamberlain's garden at precisely 3:30, a location he would check when opportunity allowed, and Clara had spent the night composing and discarding a dozen responses before settling on words that were honest if guarded, admitting that the letters had awakened something in her she had thought long dead, that she treasured each word even as she feared the inevitable revelation that would prove them either mistake or cruel entertainment, and that whoever he was, she wished him to know his correspondence had given her a glimpse of what connection might feel like between two minds that recognized each other across the arbitrary barriers society erected. Martha had confirmed what Clara's heart already suspected, that the Duke himself was the author, pointing out details of timing and observation that could belong to no other, and though Clara's reason insisted this was impossible, that dukes did not fall in love with impoverished companions 8 years past their prime, her heart had begun to hope with a painful intensity that made breathing difficult when Alexander was near. Now she watched as he arrived, moving through the assembled guests with that unconscious authority that marked his rank, and Isabella positioned herself artfully beside a climbing rose as though she had not spent 10 minutes arranging the scene. But Clara noticed immediately that Alexander's attention seemed fractured, his gaze moving restlessly across the garden paths, searching. and twice his eyes passed over Isabella to scan the wider grounds before he recalled himself to proper attention. The little clock on her chatelaine showed 2:30, and Clara's heart hammered against her ribs because she had written the letter, sealed it with hands that shook, and tucked it into her reticule with the intention of leaving it as instructed. But now the moment approached, and terror warred with desperate hope. For once she placed that letter, she would have declared herself, made vulnerable her carefully guarded heart, and there would be no retreat from whatever followed. She watched Alexander offer his arm to Isabella, observed them begin a circuit of the rose gardens while other guests smiled knowingly, and Lydia Ashford's sharp features arranged themselves in satisfied anticipation of witnessing a betrothal. But Clara saw what others missed, the tension in Alexander's shoulders, the way his responses to Isabella's animated chatter came a beat too slow, as though his mind occupied itself elsewhere. And when their path took them past the ancient sundial that stood in a quiet corner where two paths intersected, Clara saw his gaze fix upon it with unmistakable intensity. She waited until the couple moved beyond sight around a hedge of boxwood, then slipped away from the main party, her heart in her throat, moving with the invisibility she had perfected through years of being overlooked until she reached the sundial, where shadows pooled despite the afternoon brightness. Her hands trembled as she withdrew the folded paper from her reticule, and for a long moment she stood frozen, the letter poised above the sundial's base where a small gap between stone and earth created a natural hiding place, and she thought of all the reasons this was foolish, dangerous, impossible. But then she remembered the words that had sustained her through lonely mornings, the recognition that had made her feel seen for the first time in her adult life, and she tucked the letter carefully into its hiding place before walking quickly away, her pulse racing, her fate now sealed and waiting. When she rejoined the party, she found Isabella holding court among a group of matrons, her colour high and her manner brittle, and Clara's stomach tightened with foreboding. Alexander stood 10 feet distant, speaking with Lord Chamberlain, but his body angled toward the sundial path, and as Clara watched, he excused himself and moved in that direction with barely concealed purpose, and Isabella's eyes followed him with dawning confusion that sharpened into suspicion when he did not return after several minutes. Clara forced herself to remain still, to sip lemonade she could not taste, to nod at appropriate moments while Martha made quiet conversation beside her. But every nerve strained toward that distant corner of the garden where her letter waited, and Alexander even now must be reading words she had never imagined speaking aloud. When he finally reappeared, his expression had transformed entirely, something fierce and tender and determined replacing the distant courtesy he had worn like armor. And he moved through the crowd, not toward Isabella, but scanning faces until his gaze locked with Clara's across 30 feet of manicured lawn, and in that moment of connection, she saw the truth written plainly in his eyes, recognition and promise and certainty, and her knees went weak. He turned then toward Isabella, his expression settling into resolve, and Clara watched with a strange detachment as he approached her friend, spoke quietly, and Isabella's anticipated joy crumbled into confusion, and then hurt, as whatever words he offered were clearly not the ones she had expected, and society's collective held breath released in a wave of whispered speculation that rolled across the garden like wind through wheat, because the Duke of Westmont had not proposed, had instead taken his leave with unusual abruptness, and Isabella stood alone among the roses with her dreams of a coronet dissolving in the afternoon light, while Clara's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis toward an impossible, terrifying, miraculous future. May 15th, 1817. Clara woke to weak sunlight filtering through the thin curtains of her modest room in the upper floor of Isabella's townhouse. the worn carpet beside her narrow bed showing threadbare patches that spoke to years of servants' feet traversing the same path, and she lay still for a long moment, staring at the water-stained ceiling, while her heart hammered with the residual anxiety that had haunted her sleep. For 5 days had passed since Lady Chamberlain's garden party, where Alexander had failed to propose, and society's anticipation had curdled into speculation. 5 days during which Isabella's mood had deteriorated from confusion to petulance to a brittle gaiety that rang false. 5 days during which Clara had waited with increasing desperation for some word, some sign that her letter had not been a terrible mistake that would result in exposure and humiliation. And the rosewood box beneath her pillow contained 27 letters, but no new ones had arrived since she had left her reply, and the silence terrified her more than any words could have. She rose and performed her morning ablutions with mechanical precision, pouring water from the chipped pitcher into the basin, washing her face and hands in the cold water that made her gasp, pinning her dark hair into its customary simple knot, and she was fastening the buttons of her grey morning dress when she heard the soft scratch at her door that signalled one of the housemaids, and when she opened it, the girl stood there with eyes downcast, holding a folded paper sealed with unfamiliar wax, and Clara's hands trembled so violently when she took it that she nearly dropped it before pressing a coin into the maid's hand and closing the door with her shoulder already leaning against it for support. The seal broke under her thumb, and she unfolded the heavy paper with its familiar script that had become more precious to her than any material possession, and she read words that made the room tilt and spin around her. My dearest Clara, for I can no longer pretend even to myself that formality serves any purpose between us. I write to explain my silence and to beg your patience for a few days more. Your letter, which I discovered in the place we agreed upon, has altered everything, for your words confirmed what I had scarcely dared hope, that the connection I have felt growing between us through these exchanges of thought and feeling has not been merely the product of my own desperate imagination, but something real and mutual, and worth any risk or sacrifice to preserve. I cannot continue the deception that has allowed me to know you. I cannot in honour court Miss Fairfax while my heart and intentions belong entirely to you, and I must resolve the current situation with honesty before I can declare myself openly. But I promise you this will happen soon, within days, not weeks, and I ask only that you trust me a little longer, and believe that every word I have written to you came from the deepest truth of my heart, that I see you Clara Thornhill with a clarity that has nothing to do with society's blind measures of worth, and what I see is a woman of intelligence and sensitivity and quiet strength, whose company has become necessary to my happiness, whose mind challenges and delights me, whose person I long to know not through stolen moments and secret letters, but openly and honourably as my wife. If you will consent to such a future with a man who has pursued you through unconventional means because convention would have kept us forever apart, I remain yours in hope and certainty. A. The letter fell from Clara's nerveless fingers, and she sank onto the edge of her bed, with both hands pressed to her mouth, because the words, wife and Alexander's initial together, made real what she had suspected but not quite believed, that Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Westmont, truly was her correspondent, truly had been courting her through words while maintaining the fiction of pursuing Isabella, and the impossibility of it crashed over her in waves that left her gasping. Martha found her 20 minutes later, still sitting frozen with tears streaming down her face, and the older woman took one look at the fallen letter and Clara's expression, and closed the door firmly before settling beside her on the narrow bed and pulling her into an embrace. "Child," Martha said quietly, "these are not tears of sorrow unless I miss my guess entirely." Clara shook her head wordlessly and retrieved the letter with shaking hands, passing it to Martha, who read it slowly, and then looked at Clara with an expression of mingled triumph and concern. "So it is the Duke as I suspected," Martha said, "and he intends to marry you, and you are terrified because this seems impossible, and you feel loyalty to Isabella, and you cannot believe a man of his position would truly choose you over all the eligible women of the ton." Clara nodded miserably, and Martha took both her hands in a firm grip. "Listen to me carefully," she said. "I am 50 years old, and I have observed human nature from every angle society permits, and I tell you that Duke loves you truly, not from pity or passing fancy, but genuine recognition of your worth. And as for Isabella," Martha's expression hardened, "that girl loves his title, not his person. She would marry him tomorrow, and spend the next 40 years bored by his company while spending his money and taking lovers. Whereas you, Clara, possess what he needs, a mind that matches his own and a heart capable of true partnership." "But dukes do not marry poor companions," Clara whispered. "Society will destroy us both. They will say I trapped him or used witchcraft or compromised him somehow, and his family will never accept me." Martha squeezed her hands almost painfully. "Perhaps," she said, "or perhaps love matters more than society's rules. Perhaps some men possess the courage to choose truth over convention, and perhaps you must decide whether you will let fear of others' judgment prevent you from accepting what your heart most desires." Clara looked down at their joined hands, at the letter on her lap with its promise of impossible future, and felt something shift inside her chest, a small seedling of hope pushing through the hard soil of years of resignation and diminished expectations. "I must tell Isabella," she said finally. "I cannot let her continue believing he intends to propose when his heart is elsewhere. It would be cruel and dishonest." Martha nodded slowly. "That is your right and perhaps your duty," she agreed, "though I suspect the conversation will not unfold as you anticipate. But Clara, you must also be prepared for what comes next, for if the Duke truly means to declare himself, then everything in your life is about to change in ways both wonderful and terrifying. And you must decide now whether you possess the courage to accept joy when it is offered, or whether you will let unworthiness rob you of the future you deserve." May 16th, 1817. The afternoon had advanced to that uncertain hour when shadows begin their slow claiming of corners and the quality of light through windows shifts from clarity to something softer and more forgiving. And Clara stood in Isabella's private sitting room with her hands clasped tightly before her and her heart beating a staccato rhythm against her ribs, because she had decided during the sleepless hours of the previous night that honesty demanded she confess everything to Isabella before events progressed beyond her control. That loyalty to their 3 years of friendship required she explain about the letters and her growing feelings and the impossible situation that had developed without Isabella's knowledge, though Martha had counselled against this course with uncharacteristic vehemence, arguing that Isabella had no claim on information about Clara's private correspondence, and that confession would serve only to complicate matters unnecessarily. But Clara's conscience insisted otherwise, and so she had requested this private conversation with studied casualness over breakfast, and Isabella had agreed with obvious impatience, for her mood had grown increasingly petulant over the 6 days since the garden party where Alexander had failed to propose, her smiles becoming brittle and her comments about the Duke's attentions taking on a defensive quality that suggested she felt the prize slipping from her grasp. Now they sat in the rose and cream sitting room with its delicate furniture and pastoral paintings, afternoon tea laid between them on the low table, and Clara searched for words to begin while Isabella fidgeted with her teacup and glanced repeatedly toward the window as though expecting someone. "Isabella," Clara began carefully, I must speak with you about something that has been weighing on my conscience, something that concerns the Duke of Westmont. And Isabella's attention snapped to her immediately with an expression that mingled hope and suspicion. "Has he spoken to you?" Isabella demanded. "Has he said something about his intentions? For I confess I cannot understand his behavior. He seemed so attentive, and then suddenly distant, and society expects an announcement, but he has called only twice in the past week, and both times stayed barely 20 minutes. And Clara felt her resolve waver under the naked anxiety in her friend's voice, but she pressed forward. "I have been receiving letters," she said quietly. "Anonymous letters that began the night of Lady Harrington's ball, and I believe I have reason to suspect that the Duke may be their author." She had expected shock, hurt, perhaps anger, but Isabella's reaction surprised her entirely, for her friend laughed, a sharp, brittle sound without humor. "Letters," Isabella said. "How very romantic for you, Clara. Mysterious correspondence like something from a novel. But what has that to do with my courtship? Surely you cannot imagine the Duke of Westmont would waste time writing letters to his intended's companion when he might simply call and speak his mind directly." Her dismissiveness stung, but Clara persisted, trying to explain the content of the letters, their increasing intimacy, the way they referenced conversations and observations that only someone in their circle could know. But Isabella interrupted her with growing irritation. "Really, Clara, this is too absurd. Probably some clerk or secretary has developed a tendre for you, and you have built it into a grand romance in your imagination. The Duke courts me. Everyone knows this. He will propose." And her voice rose slightly. "He must propose, for I have refused 2 other offers in expectation of his." Clara heard the admission beneath the words, the calculation that had nothing to do with affection, and something shifted in her understanding. "Do you love him?" Clara asked quietly, and Isabella's expression flickered with something like contempt. "Love. What does that signify? He is a duke, Clara. A duke, and I shall be a duchess with position and wealth and everything I deserve. And honestly, he is rather dull with his books and politics, but that hardly matters when one has a coronet and 4,000 a year." The mercenary frankness shocked Clara into silence, and she was still searching for response when the butler appeared at the door to announce that the Duke of Westmont had called and requested audience with Miss Thornhill specifically. The effect on Isabella was instantaneous, her entire demeanor transforming as she rose with artificial brightness and smoothed her skirts. But the butler remained firm, repeating that His Grace had asked specifically to speak with Miss Thornhill, and Isabella's smile froze into something ugly. Clara's stomach plummeted as Alexander entered the room, his tall frame filling the doorway, his expression grave and determined, and she saw Isabella's confusion shift to offense as he bowed formally to her, but turned his attention immediately to Clara. "Miss Thornhill," he said quietly, "I must speak with you, privately if you will grant me the courtesy." Isabella made a sound of protest, her face flushing with humiliation and anger. But Alexander maintained his focus on Clara with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "Your Grace," Clara managed. "Miss Fairfax is," but he interrupted gently. "I have already spoken with Miss Fairfax's guardian to end any expectations regarding my courtship of her," he said. "My purpose here is solely to speak with you." And Isabella gasped as though struck. Outside the windows, storm clouds that had been gathering all afternoon finally released their burden, and rain began to patter against glass, and Isabella stood frozen with her world crumbling visibly around her, while Alexander waited with patient determination for Clara's answer, and she found herself nodding numbly, unable to speak, as the first crack of thunder rolled across the London sky, and Isabella's carefully constructed dreams dissolved like sugar in rain. May 16th, 1817, and Isabella swept from the room in a rustle of silk and wounded pride, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her rose-water perfume and the sound of the storm intensifying against the windows, rain now sheeting the glass in silver streams that caught and fractured the fading light. And Clara stood frozen in the center of the rose and cream sitting room, with her hands clenched at her sides and her breath coming in shallow gasps, because the moment she had both longed for and dreaded had arrived with stunning finality. And Alexander remained near the door he had closed quietly behind Isabella's dramatic exit, his tall frame silhouetted against the window, where lightning illuminated his profile in stark flashes that made him seem almost unreal, a figure from one of the novels she read in the small hours when sleep would not come. He moved first, turning from the window to face her fully, and his expression held none of the ducal authority he had wielded so effectively against Isabella, but rather something vulnerable and uncertain that made him seem younger than his 32 years. And he asked quietly, "Have you received letters, Miss Thornhill? Anonymous letters over these past weeks," and Clara felt her heart hammer so violently she feared it might be audible in the sudden quiet, broken only by rain and distant thunder. She nodded wordlessly because speech seemed beyond her capacity, and she watched as he took 3 careful steps closer, maintaining a respectful distance, but near enough now that she could be the tension in his shoulders beneath the expertly tailored dark coat, the slight tremor in his hands that he clasped behind his back in what she recognized as an effort at composure. "Did you reply?" he asked, his voice low and rough with emotion barely contained. "Did you leave a letter in the place I indicated?" And Clara nodded again, managing to whisper, "Yes, Your Grace," I replied. 5 days ago." And something flashed across his face that might have been relief or triumph or simple joy. He crossed the remaining distance between them with 4 long strides that brought him close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that she caught the scent of sandalwood and rain and something indefinably him. And he said with devastating gentleness, "Every word was mine, Clara. Every letter came from my hand and my heart, and I cannot continue this pretense another day." She had suspected, Martha had confirmed, but hearing the truth spoken aloud in his voice made it real in a way that stole the strength from her knees, and she swayed slightly before steadying herself through sheer force of will. "Why," she managed to ask, "why would you, a duke, pursue me in such a manner while courting Isabella? Why not simply—" But he interrupted her with a shake of his head, his blue eyes burning with intensity that pinned her in place. "Because I saw you that first night at Lady Harrington's ball," he said, standing in the alcove with that volume of Wordsworth looking so alone and yet so complete. "And I knew immediately that you possessed something rare, a quality of mind and spirit that had nothing to do with beauty by society's shallow measure and everything to do with genuine substance. And I wanted desperately to know you, to understand the thoughts behind those expressive eyes. But how could I approach you directly? The Duke of Westmont paying court to Miss Fairfax's poor companion. Society would have destroyed you as a scheming fortune hunter before we exchanged 10 words. Your reputation would have been shredded, and you would have hated me for it." Clara felt tears prick her eyes because the explanation made terrible sense, because she understood precisely how vicious the tongue could be to women who appeared to reach above their station. But still the deception stung, and she said with more heat than intended, "So you courted Isabella instead? You gave her expectations and hope while secretly writing to me. That was cruel to her and confusing to me, and I do not understand how such manipulation serves anything but your own convenience." Alexander flinched as though struck, but he did not retreat. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, "You are right. It was cruel and calculated, and I am not proud of the strategy. But Clara, I needed time to show you my heart through words before my position complicated everything, time to prove that I saw you truly and not as some prize to be collected. And yes, I needed access to your company which courting Miss Fairfax provided, and I needed to prevent other suitors from approaching her which my attention accomplished. But I swear to you that every word I wrote to you was true, while everything else was mere theatre. And if that makes me dishonourable, then I accept the judgment, because I would do it again to have this moment with you now. May 16th, 1817, and the room had grown darker still as the storm raged beyond the windows, and the fire in the grate flickered lower, casting uncertain shadows across Isabella's out and cream sitting room, while Clara stood trembling with Alexander's confession, hanging in the air between them like something tangible and fragile that might shatter if either of them moved too quickly, and she found herself stepping backward instinctively, because the enormity of what he offered terrified her more than any rejection ever had. For rejection, she understood, had lived with it for 27 years. But this acceptance, this declaration that she possessed value beyond what society measured, threatened to overturn every truth she had built her life upon. "I cannot," she whispered, and the words came tumbling out in a rush of self-protection. All the reasons catalogued in her mind during sleepless nights when she had allowed herself to imagine impossibilities before dawn's cruel light restored reality. "Your Grace, you must understand this is impossible. I am poor. My father left debts, not fortune, and I survive only through Isabella's charity and my own work as companion. I have no dowry, no connections, no prospects, and I am plain. Society has made that abundantly clear, for I have attended 4 seasons now, and received not a single offer, because gentlemen look through me as though I were glass. And I am 27 Alexander, well past the age when anyone might consider me a suitable match, and I am nobody, the daughter of a country vicar who died in disgrace from gambling debts. I have nothing to offer a duke, nothing that could possibly justify such a match." Alexander listened to this litany without interruption, but she saw something fierce ignite in his eyes as she spoke, and when she finally fell silent, he moved closer with deliberate intent, each step measured and purposeful, until he stood near enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, and he said with quiet intensity that brooked no argument, "Now I will tell you what I see, Clara Thornhill. I see a woman whose poverty has kept her honest and genuine in a world where wealth breeds artifice and pretension, whose circumstances have taught her the value of character over coin and substance over show, and I would trust her heart infinitely more than I would trust the calculated affections of some heiress who views me as a title to be collected. Your beauty is not the obvious sort that fades with fashion, but rather something subtle and intelligent that reveals itself slowly to anyone with eyes to truly see, in the way your expression transforms when you speak of books you love, in the grace of your movements when you forget to make yourself small and invisible, in the depths of your eyes that reflect a soul infinitely more lovely than any perfect feature could ever be. Your age shows me you have lived and thought and developed the depth of character that silly girls fresh from the schoolroom cannot possibly possess. You have weathered loss and disappointment and emerged with your kindness intact, and I find that infinitely more attractive than youth without substance. As for your position, your father's debts, your lack of connections, these things prove your strength, Clara, for you have maintained your dignity and integrity despite circumstances that might have driven others to bitterness or compromise. You have educated yourself, cultivated your mind, treated those around you with consistent courtesy regardless of their station, and these qualities matter far more than any dowry ever could. He paused and reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing several folded papers that she recognized with a jolt as her own letters, her replies that she had left in the appointed places with trembling hands and racing heart. And he said, "You wrote to me, Clara, You wrote of loneliness and hope, and the way spring light falls through library windows. You quoted Milton and Donne, and revealed a mind that matches mine in ways I had ceased to believe possible there. So do not tell me you have nothing to offer, when you have already given me something I did not know I was starving for." Clara felt tears spill over and track down her cheeks, because his words dismantled every defense she had carefully constructed, and he stepped closer still, close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. And he asked gently, "Can you truly say the letters meant nothing to you? Can you honestly claim you felt no connection to the man who wrote them?" And she shook her head mutely, because lies were impossible in the face of such directness. "They meant everything," she whispered. "They were the most precious gift anyone has ever given me." And he smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his usually reserved features into something boyish and unguarded, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished, and took her hand in his touch warm and solid and real, and he asked, "Can you believe, Clara, that someone might love you for yourself, truly and wholly, without calculation or pretense?" And she struggled, because that belief required overturning 27 years of evidence to the contrary. But he waited with infinite patience, while distant thunder rolled, and somewhere beyond the closed door, Isabella's raised voice demanded entrance from a servant instructed to grant them privacy. And finally Clara whispered, "I want to believe. Alexander, I want so desperately to believe." And his fingers tightened on hers as he said, "Then that is enough for now. We will build the rest together." But before either of them could speak further, the door burst open, and Isabella stood, framed in the doorway, with Martha hurrying behind her, trying vainly to prevent the intrusion, and the fragile moment shattered as reality came crashing back with all its complications and consequences, and Clara's hand jerked away from Alexander's as though burned, while Isabella's eyes went immediately to their joined hands, and her face contorted with fury and betrayal, and something uglier still. May 16th, 1817, and Isabella stood framed in the doorway with her face contorted by fury. And something darker still, a rage born not of love wounded, but of vanity thwarted and social ambition crushed, and she advanced into the room with her pink silk skirts rustling like the hiss of a serpent, while her voice emerged shrill and sharp as she demanded, "How dare you? How dare you, Clara, after everything I have done for you, taking you in when your father died in disgrace, leaving you nothing but debts and shame, giving you a home and position when no one else would have you. And this is how you repay my generosity, by scheming behind my back to steal the Duke away from me like some common fortune hunter." Clara flinched backward as though physically struck, while her face drained of color and her hands trembled at her sides. But before she could stammer any response, Alexander moved with swift purpose to position himself between Isabella and Clara, his tall frame forming a barrier, and his expression transformed into something cold and ducal that Clara had never seen directed at anyone. And he said with devastating calm, "Miss Fairfax, you will lower your voice and moderate your tone when speaking to Miss Thornhill, and you will cease making accusations that have no basis in truth." Isabella gaped at him as though he had struck her, her eyes wide with disbelief that he would defend her. Paid companion over herself, and she recovered enough to snap, "No basis in truth. I find you alone with her in the dark, holding her hand, and making heaven knows what sort of declarations, while you have been courting me for weeks, and all of society expects you to propose to me. And you claim she has not schemed for this, not angled and manipulated to trap you into some sort of compromise." Alexander's jaw tightened visibly, and Clara saw the effort it cost him to maintain his composure as he stated with ice in his voice, "I pursued Miss Thornhill not the reverse. She has done nothing but exist with grace and dignity while I orchestrated circumstances to be near her. So if you must assign blame for disappointed expectations, then place it squarely where it belongs, with me and my own choices." Isabella's face flushed red and white in alternating waves as the full meaning of his words penetrated, and she demanded shrilly, "How long? How long has this deception been occurring?" And Alexander answered with brutal honesty, "Since the moment I first saw her at Lady Harrington's ball, since that very first night I knew she was the woman I wished to know, and the only one I could imagine beside me. And everything that came after was my attempt to court her without destroying her reputation in the process." Isabella released a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, high and slightly unhinged, and she said with venom, "Well, you have certainly failed at protecting her reputation, because the moment I leave this room, I will ensure that every drawing-room in London knows that Clara Thornhill is a scheming seducer who used her position as my companion to trap the Duke of Westmont. And society will tear her apart, Alexander. You know they will. They will call her every vile name, and she will never be received anywhere respectable, and you will be pitied as the fool she ensnared." Clara made a small, wounded sound because she knew with terrible certainty that Isabella spoke truth, that society would indeed destroy her, regardless of actual events. But Alexander turned his head slightly to meet her gaze, and something in his eyes steadied her before he addressed Isabella again with finality, "Which is precisely why I will marry Miss Thornhill immediately by special license, giving her my name and protection and the full weight of my title before any gossip can take root, and as my Duchess, she will be untouchable regardless of what you or anyone else attempts to whisper about her." The door opened again, and Martha Langley entered somewhat breathlessly, her sensible grey dress and worried expression suggesting she had hurried from wherever the servants had found her, and she crossed directly to Clara's side and took her cold hand in a warm, firm grip that communicated solidarity and support, and Isabella rounded on her as well, with a sneer as she said, "Of course you are part of this, Martha," probably encouraging her to reach above her station and grasp for what she has no right to claim. Alexander's voice cut across the room like a blade as he said with unmistakable authority, "Miss Fairfax, you will say nothing of what has occurred here to anyone, or I will make it my personal business to ensure that every gentleman in London knows that you viewed my courtship purely as a business transaction, that you admitted to Miss Thornhill that you found me boring, but my title irresistible, and I suspect your matrimonial prospects will suffer considerably from such revelations." Isabella's mouth fell open in shock that he would threaten her so directly, that the polite Duke who had called on her faithfully would transform into this cold aristocrat, wielding social power like a weapon, and she stood frozen for a long moment before gathering her skirts and fleeing the room with something very like a sob catching in her throat. And the sound of her rapid footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving behind only the crackle of the dying fire and the gentler sound of rain against the windows as the storm finally began to ease. Clara stood trembling with Martha's hand gripping hers, and her mind struggling to process the past quarter hour that had upended her entire existence. And Alexander turned from the doorway to face her fully, and his expression softened from ducal coldness to something tender and uncertain. And he crossed the space between them before lowering himself to one knee on the rose-patterned carpet. With a grace that suggested the gesture cost him nothing in dignity, and he said quietly, "Miss Thornhill, Clara, I know this is precipitous by any conventional measure, but we have been courting for a month through letters, and I know your mind and heart and soul as you know mine, and I love you truly and wholly and irrevocably. So I ask you now, properly and before witness, will you consent to be my wife?" May 16th, 1817, and the firelight cast dancing shadows across the rose-patterned carpet, where Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Westmont, knelt before Clara Thornhill with his dark eyes steady on her face and his expression open in a way she had never witnessed during all those carefully orchestrated weeks of courtship directed toward Isabella, and he said with quiet intensity that carried the weight of absolute truth, "Miss Thornhill, Clara, I know this appears precipitous by any conventional measure, and society will certainly judge the suddenness of my proposal, but we have been courting for a month through letters, and in those exchanges I have come to know your mind with its sharp wit and literary sensitivity, your heart with its capacity for kindness despite the disappointments you have endured, and your soul with its depth and integrity that puts to shame the shallow concerns of the fashionable world, and you know mine equally well, for I have hidden nothing in those letters, revealed myself more completely than I ever have to another living person. And I love you truly and wholly and irrevocably, not for any advantage you might bring, but simply for yourself, for the woman who quotes Donne and Milton, who notices how spring light falls through library windows, who treats servants with courtesy and bears slights with dignity. So I ask you now properly and before witness, will you consent to be my wife? Will you trust me enough to believe that what I offer is real and lasting and worth whatever temporary storms we must weather together?" Clara stood frozen with Martha's warm hand still gripping hers, and her entire body trembling as though she stood on the edge of a precipice, and she looked down at Alexander kneeling there, with his dark hair slightly dishevelled from running his hands through it, and his cravat loosened from the evening's emotional tumult, and she turned her head slightly to meet Martha's gaze, seeking guidance or permission, or perhaps simply reassurance that she was not dreaming this impossible scene. Martha's lined face was soft with emotion, and she nodded encouragingly while squeezing Clara's hand. And Clara felt all her carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble as she looked back at Alexander and tried to speak past the tightness in her throat. But the words that emerged were not acceptance, but rather one final catalogue of fears as she said, "Society will mock you, Alexander. They will call me fortune hunter and schemer. They will say I trapped you or compromised you or used some sort of manipulation. And you will spend years defending a choice that diminishes you in their eyes, and I cannot bear to be the source of your regret." Alexander's expression shifted to something fierce and tender simultaneously, as he responded, "Clara, look at me. Truly look at me. Do I appear uncertain or coerced or trapped? Society's opinion means less than nothing when weighed against the prospect of spending my life with a woman I can respect as well as love, a partner with whom I can discuss philosophy and literature, someone who sees beyond the title to the man beneath, and I need your answer now, not society's approval. So I ask you again, do you love me? Not the Duke of Westmont, but the man who has been writing to you each day, laying bare his thoughts and hopes and fears." Clara felt tears spill over and track down her cheeks as she whispered, "I love the man who wrote those letters, who saw me when no one else did, who made me feel valued and understood for the first time in my life, and he said with absolute conviction, 'That man is kneeling before you, Clara. That man is asking you to be his wife. That man will spend the rest of his life ensuring you never doubt your worth again. So what is your answer?'" The silence stretched for several heartbeats while the fire crackled, and the storm outside finally began to ease. And somewhere in the house a clock chimed the hour, and then Clara's emotional dam broke completely as she said, in a voice choked with joy and disbelief and overwhelming hope, "Yes, yes, Alexander, I will marry you. I will trust you. I will believe that this is real." Alexander rose in one fluid movement and took both her hands in his and raised them to his lips, kissing first one and then the other with a reverence that made Clara's breath catch. and Martha released a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob as she pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, and Alexander said while still holding Clara's hands, "We will marry by special license within the week, before gossip can solidify into something more damaging, and I will spend every day thereafter proving that you made the right choice in accepting me." Clara nodded mutely because words seemed inadequate to the enormity of what had just transpired, and she was aware of Martha embracing her from behind, and Alexander's thumbs stroking across her knuckles, and the way the firelight made everything seem warm and golden and possible. And she thought that perhaps Martha had been right all along, that love truly could transcend the arbitrary limitations society attempted to impose, and that it was never too late for new beginnings if one possessed the courage to reach for them when they appeared. May 20th, 1817. And the morning light fell pale and tentative through the windows of Martha Langley's modest home on the respectable but unfashionable edge of Bloomsbury, and Clara Thornhill stood in the small upstairs room that had become her refuge since leaving Isabella's household, 4 days prior, her hands smoothing repeatedly over the ivory silk of the wedding dress draped across the narrow bed, as though touch alone could convince her that the garment was real and the marriage it represented not some fever dream born of desperation and loneliness. The house around her hummed with subdued activity as Martha's 2 servants moved through their morning tasks, but Clara could hear the whispers that followed their comings and goings, the gossip they brought back from market and shops, the vicious rumours that Isabella Fairfax had indeed unleashed upon London society with all the vindictive energy of a woman scorned not in affection but in ambition, and Lydia Ashford had seized upon the scandal with gleeful malice and embellished it beyond recognition until Clara barely recognized herself in the tales being circulated. She had heard from Martha's maid that drawing-rooms across Mayfair buzzed with speculation about how the plain, penniless companion had trapped the Duke of Westmont, some saying she had compromised him deliberately, others whispering darker suggestions of manipulation or even witchcraft, and the few calling cards that had arrived at Martha's door over the past days had been evenly divided between genuine congratulations from people of sense and cutting remarks thinly disguised as well-wishes from those who believed the worst and wished to make their judgment clear. Clara's courage wavered as she stood alone in the modest room with its worn carpet and simple furnishings that spoke so clearly of her true station, and she pressed one hand to her stomach where anxiety coiled tight and cold as she thought of Alexander facing the social consequences of choosing her, his reputation questioned and his judgment mocked by people whose good opinion he had possessed without effort his entire life until he made the mistake of offering his heart to someone society deemed unworthy of such an honor. Martha entered without knocking, as was her comfortable habit, her lined face creased with concern as she observed Clara's pale complexion and trembling hands, and she crossed the room to grip Clara's shoulders firmly, while saying with characteristic directness, "You are thinking of calling it off, of releasing him from his obligation because you fear the damage to his standing. But I tell you, Clara Thornhill, that love matters more than the fleeting approval of people who judge worth by bloodlines and bank accounts rather than character and integrity. And Alexander Pembroke knows his own mind and has chosen you with full awareness of the consequences." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but was interrupted by sounds of arrival downstairs, masculine voices, and the bustle that accompanied any visit from the Duke. And moments later, Alexander himself appeared in the doorway, with his dark hair slightly wind-blown and his expression transformed by unmistakable relief as his gaze found Clara and held, and he said with barely contained excitement, "I bring unexpected news. My cousin Lady Margaret Pembroke has made it her business to publicly endorse our match. She called yesterday at 3 separate houses, including Lady Harrington's, to declare you a woman of exceptional character and intellect whose company she looks forward to cultivating. And my aunt Lady Westbrook, who is formidable enough to intimidate even the most determined gossips, has also given her approval, having taken it upon herself to investigate your background thoroughly, and finding only respectability and virtue despite your father's unfortunate financial difficulties." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at this demonstration of support from women she had never met, family members who might have been expected to oppose the match, but instead chose to defend her against society's judgment, and Alexander crossed the room to take her hands in his, while continuing, "The tide may turn, Clara, or it may not. There will always be small-minded people who cannot see past convention to recognize genuine worth. But I am certain in my choice, and nothing that Lydia Ashford or Isabella Fairfax or anyone else whispers will change my commitment to you or my conviction that you are exactly the woman I wish to spend my life beside." He released one of her hands to draw something from his coat pocket, a delicate strand of pearls that glowed softly in the morning light, simple and elegant without ostentation, and he said quietly, "These were my mother's, given to her by my father not because of her dowry or connections, but because he loved her truly, and she wore them on their wedding day and every anniversary thereafter until she died. And I want you to wear them in 3 days when you become my wife, as a symbol that what we have is built on the same foundation of genuine affection and respect that sustained their marriage through 30 years. May 23rd, 1817, and the small chapel of St. Mary le Strand was filled with morning light that streamed through the plain glass windows and fell across the worn stone floor where Clara Thornhill stood in the vestibule wearing the ivory silk dress and the simple strand of pearls that had belonged to Alexander's mother, her hands trembling so badly that Martha had to steady them while arranging the short veil of Brussels lace that Lady Margaret Pembroke had sent with a note declaring that every bride deserved something beautiful and new regardless of the circumstances of her engagement. The chapel was nearly empty because Alexander had insisted on a private ceremony with only Martha and his cousin Robert Pembroke as witnesses, sparing Clara the ordeal of facing a congregation filled with curious stares and whispered judgments, though she knew that the absence of a grand society wedding would itself become fodder for gossip and speculation among those who were determined to view the match as scandalous or irregular. Martha adjusted the veil one final time and then stepped back to survey Clara with eyes that held both pride and affection, as she said quietly that Clara looked every inch a duchess regardless of what small-minded people might say. And Clara tried to smile, but found her face frozen with a mixture of terror and overwhelming joy, because even now, standing at the threshold of the chapel with the scent of beeswax candles and old stone in her nostrils and the distant sound of London traffic muffled by thick walls, some part of her still could not quite believe that this was truly happening, and not some elaborate dream from which she would wake to find herself once again invisible and overlooked in Isabella's shadow. The organ began its simple processional, and Martha squeezed her hand once more before releasing it, and Clara stepped forward into the chapel's nave, where Alexander stood waiting beside the altar with his dark coat immaculately tailored, and his expression transforming with unmistakable emotion as his gaze found her and held, and she saw in his eyes the same man who had written 32 letters laying bare his heart in careful script, the same man who had knelt in Martha's modest parlor and asked her to trust him, the same man who had spent the past week managing social consequences and family reactions and practical arrangements while visiting her daily to ensure she knew she was not alone in facing the storm they had created. Clara walked toward him slowly, each step carrying her further from the life of invisibility and resignation she had accepted as her permanent condition, and closer to a future she had never dared imagine, even in her most secret hopes. And as she reached Alexander's side and placed her trembling hand in his steady one, she felt the last remnants of her internalized unworthiness begin to crack and crumble beneath the weight of his steady regard, and the simple fact that he had chosen her, not out of duty or compromise or manipulation, but because he genuinely loved the woman she was beneath society's dismissive judgments. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of traditional words and responses, the vicar's voice echoing in the small space as he spoke of love and honor and commitment. And Clara heard herself making vows that bound her life to Alexander's, while thinking of all those letters she had saved in their locked box, tangible proof that what they shared was built on genuine understanding and intellectual connection, rather than the superficial attractions that governed most society matches. And when Alexander slipped a gold ring onto her finger and bent to kiss her with careful reverence before the altar, Clara felt tears slide down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the stunning realization that she was truly worthy of being loved, that her years of being overlooked and dismissed had not been a reflection of her actual value, but merely a failure of vision on the part of those too shallow to see beyond convention, to recognize character and depth. May 23rd, 1817, and the late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Westmont House as Clara Pembroke, who had been Clara Thornhill until 6 hours prior when she spoke vows in the small chapel of St. Mary le Strand, stood in the doorway of what the housekeeper Mrs. Davies had identified as her private sitting room, a gracious space decorated in soft blues and creams that overlooked the square's central garden, and she felt the unreality of her situation wash over her again because this morning she had woken in Martha's modest spare bedroom, and now she stood in a ducal mansion as its mistress with a gold ring on her finger and a new name that still felt strange and borrowed when she tried to apply it to herself. Alexander had brought her directly to the house after the wedding breakfast at his cousin Robert's home, a small gathering of perhaps 20 people who had represented his immediate family and closest friends. And Clara had been overwhelmed by their warmth because she had expected at best cold civility and at worst open hostility from people who would view her as an interloper and fortune hunter. But Lady Margaret Pembroke had embraced her and called her cousin with genuine affection, and Alexander's aunt, Lady Westbrook, had studied her with shrewd eyes before pronouncing that Alexander had chosen well, and any fool could see the girl had sense and character, which were worth more than a dozen empty-headed beauties with impeccable pedigrees. Now Alexander stood behind her in the sitting-room doorway, and she felt his presence like warmth against her back as he said quietly that the room had been his mother's favorite retreat, and he thought Clara might appreciate having a space that was entirely her own, where she could read and write without interruption, and she turned to face him with tears threatening, because the thoughtfulness of the gesture and the understanding it represented overwhelmed her fragile composure. He crossed the room to take her hands, his expression tender and slightly concerned, as he asked if she was well, if everything was too much too soon, and Clara shook her head, because she could not find words adequate to explain the tangle of emotions that filled her chest. The joy and terror and lingering disbelief that warred for dominance, while she struggled to accept that this transformation in her circumstances was real and permanent, and not some temporary reprieve from the invisibility that had defined her existence for so long. Alexander drew her to the settee by the window, and they sat together in the golden afternoon light, while he told her gently that he understood she needed time to adjust to her new position, that he expected nothing from her except that she be exactly herself, the woman whose intelligence and sensitivity and quiet strength had captured his heart from the moment he watched her reading poetry in an alcove at Lady Harrington's ball, while the rest of the world danced and chattered and failed to see what was directly before them. Clara leaned against his shoulder, a liberty she would never have dared even that morning, and felt the steady rhythm of his breathing and the solid reality of his presence. and she thought of the 32 letters she had brought with her from Martha's house, now locked safely in the escritoire that stood against the far wall, tangible proof that this man had chosen her deliberately and persistently despite every social obstacle and practical argument against their union. June 3rd, 1817, and Clara had been the Duchess of Westmont for 11 days when Alexander suggested quietly over breakfast that perhaps they might venture out together to the pump room at mid-morning, when society would be gathered for the daily ritual of taking the waters and exchanging gossip. And she felt her hands go cold around her teacup because she had been sheltered within the walls of Westmont House since their wedding day, protected from the worst of the social scrutiny by Alexander's careful management and the loyalty of his family connections. But she knew that eventually she would have to face the collective judgment of the ton and endure the stares and whispers that would follow a former companion who had somehow captured a duke's heart, despite having neither fortune nor beauty nor impeccable lineage to recommend her. Alexander reached across the small table in the breakfast room where morning light fell across the remains of their meal, and he covered her trembling hand with his own as he said gently that he would not force her, but he thought it important that they present a united front sooner rather than later. That every day she remained hidden would only fuel speculation and give credence to the rumors that Isabella and Lydia Ashford continued to spread about manipulation and entrapment. And Clara knew he was right, even as her stomach twisted with anxiety, because she had heard the whispers that filtered back through servants and the few supporters who had called at Westmont House, whispers that painted her as everything from a scheming adventuress who had used feminine wiles to trap an unsuspecting nobleman to a pathetic creature who had compromised herself deliberately to force a marriage that would lift her from obscurity into a position far above her natural station. She looked at Alexander's face in the morning light and saw the quiet confidence there, the absolute certainty that had characterized every interaction since that stormy evening when he had knelt in Martha's parlor and asked her to become his wife. And she thought of the 32 letters that remained locked in her private sitting room upstairs, tangible evidence that their connection was built on genuine understanding rather than opportunistic scheming. And she found herself nodding slowly, because she could not hide forever, and because some part of her that had been awakened by his persistent courtship refused to cower in shame when she had done nothing wrong except dare to accept love from a man whose social position exceeded her own. They arrived at the pump room shortly before noon, and Clara felt every eye in the crowded space turn toward them as they entered, felt the sudden hush that fell over conversations and the sharp intake of collective breath, as society registered the presence of the scandalous new Duchess, making her first public appearance since a wedding that had been conducted with such haste and privacy that it had sparked endless speculation about the circumstances that might have necessitated such unseemly speed. And she kept her spine straight and her chin level as Alexander guided her forward with his hand steady at the small of her back, his touch conveying support and solidarity, even as Lydia Ashford's voice carried across the room in a stage whisper about companions who forgot their place, and dukes who made regrettable decisions in moments of misguided chivalry. June 3rd, 1817, continued from the same mid-morning hour, and Alexander's hand tightened almost imperceptibly against Clara's back as he guided her forward through the crowded pump room while conversations resumed around them in pointed whispers that carried clearly across the marble floors, and she felt the weight of judgment pressing against her from every direction as they moved toward the serving table where attendants dispensed glasses of the allegedly medicinal waters that no one truly believed cured anything, but which provided the essential excuse for society's daily gathering to observe and dissect one another's affairs with surgical precision. Lady Margaret Pembroke materialized beside them with the perfect timing that suggested she had been watching for their arrival, and she greeted Clara with warmth that bordered on theatrical as she kissed her cheek and declared loudly enough for nearby listeners to hear that she had been hoping the new Duchess would make an appearance because she was hosting a small dinner party on Friday evening and absolutely required Clara and Alexander's attendance, and the calculated public support from Alexander's well-connected cousin created a ripple of recalibration through the assembled observers who would now need to adjust their calculations about how viciously they could attack Clara without risking their own social standing. Lydia Ashford stood near the windows with Isabella beside her, and Clara felt her former friend's eyes boring into her with an intensity that carried equal parts rage and disbelief, and she understood that Isabella had truly believed Alexander would come to his senses and return to court her properly once the initial infatuation wore off, that a man of his position would never actually marry a woman like Clara when he could have any accomplished beauty in London, and the reality of seeing Clara enter the pump room as the Duchess of Westmont with Alexander's hand protective at her back must have shattered whatever fantasy Isabella had constructed about the temporary nature of this inappropriate attachment. Alexander accepted a glass of water and handed it to Clara before taking one for himself. And the simple domestic gesture of care seemed to enrage Lydia further because she moved closer with Isabella trailing behind and said in a voice pitched to carry that it was remarkable how quickly some women could elevate themselves through convenient opportunities, and Alexander turned to face her with an expression of such cold ducal authority that several nearby conversations faltered into silence as he replied that it was indeed remarkable how love could reveal what had always been present but required discerning eyes to recognize. And he smiled down at Clara with unmistakable tenderness as he added that he considered himself extraordinarily fortunate that he had possessed sufficient wisdom to value character and intelligence over the superficial attractions that impressed less perceptive men. June 3rd, 1817, continued from the same mid-morning hour at the pump room, and the silence that followed Alexander's pointed response to Lydia Ashford stretched across the marble space like a drawn breath before someone must speak or suffocate, and Clara felt the collective attention of society weighing upon her as she stood beside her husband, with her hand steady around the glass of medicinal water, while her heart hammered against her ribs in a rhythm that surely everyone present could hear echoing across the polished floors. Lydia's face had gone rigid with the kind of fury that comes from being publicly contradicted by someone whose social position made retaliation impossible, and she opened her mouth as though to deliver some cutting response. But Alexander's expression remained so coldly authoritative that even Lydia Ashford, who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of social cruelty, seemed to recognize that she had pushed too far and risked finding herself on the wrong side of ducal displeasure, and she closed her mouth again with visible effort while Isabella beside her looked between Clara and Alexander with something approaching desperation in her eyes, as though she still could not quite accept that this peculiar arrangement had solidified into an actual marriage that showed no signs of the dissolution she had been predicting with such confidence to anyone who would listen. Lady Margaret touched Clara's arm gently and began speaking about the planned dinner party with determined cheerfulness, drawing attention away from the confrontation and giving the assembled observers permission to resume their conversations. And Clara felt the tension in the room shift from shocked silence to animated discussion as people turned to their neighbors to dissect what they had just witnessed and recalibrate their opinions about the scandalous Duchess of Westmont, who had somehow secured not only a duke's hand in marriage, but also his clear devotion and the public support of his influential family connections. Alexander guided Clara toward the serving table where they could stand with Lady Margaret and present a united front, while around them the social machinery of Bath churned through this new development, and Clara caught fragments of whispered conversations that ranged from grudging admiration for her unexpected triumph to continued skepticism about the longevity of such an unlikely match. but she noticed that even the most critical voices had adopted a more cautious tone now that Alexander had made his position so abundantly clear, and Lady Margaret had reinforced her intention to sponsor Clara's entrance into proper society, despite the irregularity of her origins. Martha appeared at Clara's other side with perfect timing, having entered the pump room unnoticed during the confrontation, and she nodded approvingly at Alexander before turning to Clara with a look of such fierce pride that Clara felt her eyes sting with tears she absolutely could not shed in this public space where any sign of weakness would be interpreted as confirmation that she was indeed overwhelmed by her sudden elevation and unequal to the demands of her new position. And she blinked hard and smiled at Martha while accepting another glass of water from Alexander's hand, the simple gesture of care speaking more eloquently than any public declaration about the genuine nature of the connection between them. June 3rd, 1817, continued from the late mid-morning hour at the pump room, and Clara stood between Alexander and Martha while Lady Margaret engaged her in conversation about fashion and music and the various entertainments Bath offered during the season, all subjects calculated to demonstrate to watching observers that the new Duchess of Westmont possessed the accomplishments and social graces necessary for her elevated position despite her unconventional origins as a paid companion, and Clara answered with careful attention to both Lady Margaret's questions and the peripheral awareness of dozens of eyes tracking her every gesture and expression for signs of inadequacy or pretension that might justify continued social judgment. The medicinal water in her glass had grown tepid, and even more unpleasant than it had been when first poured. But she sipped it periodically because Alexander had given it to her, and the simple act of accepting his care felt like a small declaration of their partnership that anyone observing could interpret as they wished, and she noticed that several younger women who had been whispering behind fans near the windows now watched Alexander with expressions of calculation that suggested they were reassessing whether his obvious devotion to his unexpected duchess indicated some hidden quality in Clara that their initial dismissal had caused them to overlook, or whether it represented merely an inexplicable masculine whim that would fade with familiarity. Isabella had withdrawn to the far side of the pump room with Lydia, and the two women stood with their heads close together in the unmistakable posture of conspiracy. And Clara felt a pang of something that was not quite loss because she had already mourned the friendship she had believed existed before realizing how little genuine affection had ever existed beneath Isabella's casual exploitation of her companionship, but rather a kind of melancholy recognition that 3 years of her life had been spent in service to someone who had never valued her as anything more than a useful accessory to reflect her own superiority. Martha touched Clara's elbow gently and gestured toward the door with the subtle suggestion that they might consider departing before the social exposure became overwhelming. And Alexander noticed the exchange and nodded almost imperceptibly before turning to Lady Margaret with thanks for her support and a confirmation that they would indeed attend her dinner party on Friday evening. And Lady Margaret kissed Clara's cheek again with theatrical warmth before declaring loudly that she was already planning the seating arrangements because she had several particular friends she wished the Duchess to meet, women of intelligence and character, who would appreciate Clara's qualities and provide the foundation for a proper social circle that valued substance over superficial accomplishment. Alexander guided Clara toward the exit with his hand steady at her back, and she felt the weight of collective observation following their progress across the marble floor, while conversations swirled around them with the barely contained excitement of people who had just witnessed a social drama that would fuel discussion for days and possibly weeks, depending on how the various participants chose to navigate the aftermath. And she understood that this public appearance had been a necessary first step in establishing her legitimacy as Alexander's wife, but that many similar trials would follow before society either accepted her elevation or relegated her permanently to the category of scandalous irregularity. June 3rd, 1817, continued from the late mid-morning hour at the pump room in Bath, and Clara descended the stone steps into the bright June sunshine, with Alexander's hand steady at her elbow, while Martha followed close behind, and the three of them presented to anyone who might be watching from the windows above a picture of unified composure that gave no indication of how thoroughly Clara's heart was still racing from the confrontation that had just concluded with Lydia Ashford's barely concealed fury, and Isabella's desperate attempts to maintain her position as primary victim of this scandalous social disruption. The carriage waited at the corner where Alexander had left it under the watchful supervision of his coachman, and as they approached, Clara noticed several passers-by who slowed their steps or turned quite obviously to observe the new Duchess of Westmont in her modest blue walking dress that had been hastily updated with new trim and ribbons, but still bore the unmistakable marks of careful economy rather than ducal expenditure, and she felt the familiar instinct to shrink from such scrutiny before remembering Alexander's words in the pump room about her right to occupy the space she had been given, and Martha's earlier counsel that morning about holding her head high, regardless of what narrow-minded observers might think about her unexpected elevation. Alexander handed her into the carriage with the same careful attention he had shown since their wedding 4 days prior, and Clara found herself noticing small details about his consideration that she suspected he had been demonstrating all along during those weeks of anonymous correspondence when he had been learning the patterns of her heart through written words, while maintaining the elaborate charade of courting Isabella for the benefit of society's expectations and his own strategic purposes. Martha settled across from them with a satisfied expression that suggested she had thoroughly enjoyed watching Lydia Ashford receive a public set-down from a duke who clearly had no patience for malicious gossip about his chosen wife, and as the carriage lurched into motion along Bath's elegant streets, Clara felt some of the tension that had been coiling in her shoulders since they had entered the pump room begin to gradually release, while Alexander's presence beside her provided a kind of steady reassurance that she was still learning to accept as genuine rather than temporary. The morning sunshine streamed through the carriage windows and illuminated the pearl necklace at Clara's throat. The family piece Alexander had given her 3 days earlier, with the explanation that it had belonged to his mother, who had also married for love rather than social advantage, and who had spent 30 happy years with his father before her death, when Alexander was 19 years old, and Clara touched the pearls lightly with her fingertips while watching the fashionable buildings of Bath pass by outside and trying to reconcile her internal sense of herself as invisible companion with the external reality that she was now a duchess who had just survived her first significant social confrontation with something approaching dignity intact. June 3rd, 1817, continued from the early afternoon hour in Bath, as the carriage carried them away from the pump room and back through the fashionable streets toward the townhouse Alexander had leased for their month-long wedding trip. And Clara sat beside her husband of 4 days, while trying to process the reality that she had just survived her first major social confrontation as the Duchess of Westmont, with something approaching dignity intact, despite the persistent internal voice that still whispered she was merely Clara Thornhill, who had been invisible for so many years that visibility felt like standing naked before a critical audience. Martha sat across from them with an expression of satisfaction that suggested she had thoroughly enjoyed watching Alexander dismantle Lydia Ashford's malicious attempts to undermine Clara's position, and Clara felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who had been more true friend than Isabella had ever been during 3 years of service, that Clara now recognized had been characterized by casual exploitation rather than genuine affection, and she understood that losing Isabella's so-called friendship was not actually a loss, but rather a clarification of something that had never existed in the form she had imagined it. Alexander's hand found hers on the carriage seat between them, and he wove their fingers together with the easy intimacy that still surprised Clara every time he demonstrated such casual affection, and she glanced at him to find him watching her with an expression of concern that suggested he was monitoring her emotional state for signs of distress or overwhelm that might require intervention or reassurance. The pearls at her throat caught the afternoon light streaming through the carriage window, and she touched them briefly with her free hand, while remembering how Alexander had given them to her 3 days ago, with the explanation that his mother had worn them throughout her own marriage to his father, and that they represented love chosen freely rather than arranged for social advantage. And Clara had accepted them with trembling fingers, while trying to believe she deserved to wear jewelry that had belonged to a woman who had been duchess by birth, rather than by the improbable circumstance of a duke falling in love with his intended bride's paid companion. The carriage turned onto the quieter street, where Alexander's leased townhouse stood among other elegant Bath residences, and Clara felt some of the tension that had been holding her spine rigid since they had entered the pump room that morning begin to gradually release now that they were returning to the private space where she did not have to perform the role of duchess for the benefit of watching society, but could simply be herself with Alexander and Martha, who both knew exactly who she had been before this transformation and loved her regardless. Martha leaned forward slightly and patted Clara's knee with maternal affection before saying that Clara had done beautifully, and that the way she had maintained her composure while Lydia had attempted to provoke her into some display of inappropriate emotion or social ignorance had been precisely the response required to begin establishing her legitimacy among people who wanted to find fault, but could not if she gave them no ammunition beyond the simple fact of her previous position as companion, and Clara managed a small smile while acknowledging that she had survived the ordeal, but suspected many similar trials would follow before society either accepted her elevation or relegated her permanently to the category of scandalous irregularity that would define her social existence for however long Alexander's affection lasted. June 3rd, 1817, continued from the early afternoon hour in Bath as the carriage arrived at the townhouse Alexander had leased for their wedding trip, and Clara stepped down onto the pavement with Alexander's steadying hand at her elbow while Martha descended behind them with the satisfied expression of someone who had thoroughly enjoyed watching social malice receive its proper rebuke. And the three of them entered the elegant foyer where afternoon light streamed through tall windows and illuminated the fresh flowers that Alexander had ordered delivered daily because he remembered from their correspondence that Clara loved roses, particularly the pale pink varieties that reminded her of her mother's garden from childhood. The housekeeper appeared with tea service already prepared, as though she had been monitoring their return, and Martha announced her intention to rest in her room for an hour, which Clara recognized as a diplomatic withdrawal meant to give the newly married couple time alone together. And once Martha had departed up the stairs, Clara found herself standing in the drawing-room with Alexander, while the familiar awkwardness of physical proximity returned now that they were private, and she was expected to know how to be a wife rather than simply a correspondent who had poured her heart onto paper without having to navigate the complicated reality of shared domestic space. Alexander moved to the tea service and began preparing her cup with the exact proportions of milk and sugar that she preferred, and Clara realized he must have been observing such details during those weeks when he had called at Isabella's home while ostensibly courting her friend, but actually cataloguing every small preference and habit that revealed Clara's character. And she felt simultaneously touched by his attention and unsettled by how thoroughly he had studied her, while she had believed herself invisible to everyone except the anonymous letter-writer whose identity she had suspected, but not dared to fully acknowledge. He handed her the cup, and their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Clara found herself acutely aware of the gold band on her left hand that still felt foreign and improbable after only 4 days of marriage. And she took a careful sip of tea while trying to formulate words for the complicated mixture of gratitude and lingering disbelief and persistent fear that characterized her emotional state since Alexander had knelt in Isabella's drawing room and asked her to be his wife. Alexander settled into the chair across from her rather than beside her on the sofa, and Clara understood he was giving her space to recover from the morning's ordeal at the pump room, where she had been forced to perform the role of Duchess before an audience that included people actively hoping to witness her failure or exposure as inadequate to the position she now occupied through the improbable circumstance of Alexander's affection. He asked gently if she was truly well or merely maintaining composure, and Clara found herself appreciating his ability to perceive the difference between surface presentation and internal reality, and she admitted that she felt exhausted by the constant awareness of being observed and judged and found wanting by people who had never bothered to notice her existence when she had been merely Isabella's paid companion, but now watched her every gesture for evidence of social ignorance or pretension above her proper station.